The dawn breaks slowly, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. The world is still, utterly still. The only sounds that break the morning silence are the soft, rhythmic whispers of the wind and the occasional crash of waves against the jagged rocks. A thick mist rises from the sea, wrapping the land in a cool, ghostly embrace. On the shore, a lone figure stands, his silhouette barely visible through the fog. His every movement is deliberate, each strike of his sword a perfect cut through the air, swift and graceful, yet filled with lethal intent. Each swing is like a dance fluid, precise, but with the weight of 1,000 battles behind it. The sword moves not just as an extension of his arm, but as a reflection of his very soul. Every motion is practiced, every breath measured, honed over years of relentless discipline. He stands alone, his gaze fixed on the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone to appear from the mist. This is not just any warrior. This is Sasaki Kojiro, the swordmaster, whose name will echo through the centuries. His reputation precedes him, not just as a man of exceptional skill, but as a master of the long sword, his technique said to be as swift as the swallow in flight. It is said that, in his hands, the sword dances with such grace that it almost seems to have a life of its own. But beneath the fluidity and elegance of his movements lies a mind as sharp and unyielding as his blade. Kojiro is not merely a man of skill, he is a man of purpose. His life has been defined by a singular mission to master the sword, to transcend it, and in doing so, to find the true meaning of strength and honor. And now, as the sun begins to rise over the distant hills, a moment is fast approaching that will define his legacy forever. The fog parts, the ocean's whispers grow louder, and with them, the inevitable challenge that has been whispered for years: his rival is near. The duel that will carve their names into history is not just one of combat, but of philosophy, of belief, and of the very essence of what it means to be a true warrior. For Sasaki Kojiro, this is more than a fight. It is the culmination of everything he has worked for, everything he has believed in, and the very test of his soul. With every swing, the blade moves with the elegance of a swallow in flight, quick, precise, and deadly. His reputation as a master of the long sword is unparalleled, his technique as flawless as the finest brushstroke. But Kojiro is more than just a fighter. He is a man whose life is bound to the sword, a man whose destiny is carved into the very fabric of the samurai code, a man who believes that the sword is not just a weapon, it is an extension of the soul, a path to enlightenment, and a mirror that reflects the true nature of its wielder. And yet, despite his unparalleled skill, there is a shadow that looms over Kojiro's name, a shadow of a man who is as much a legend as he is, a man whose reputation is as fearsome as Kojiro's own, whose philosophies challenge the very foundation of what it means to be a swordsman. That man is Miyamoto Musashi. The name Musashi strikes fear into the hearts of men. The wandering swordsman, known for his dual-wielding style, is a force of nature untamed, unpredictable, and unmatched. He has earned his place as one of the greatest swordsmen in Japanese history, his reputation forged in countless battles and duels. But Musashi is not just a man of skill. He is a philosopher, a man who believes that true mastery is not achieved through technique alone, but through an understanding of life, nature, and the mind. His unorthodox approach to the sword is as much about breaking the rules as it is about transcending them. For years, their names have been spoken in the same breath. Two men of incomparable skill, two warriors bound by fate, each representing a different way of life, a different philosophy of the sword. And yet, despite their growing legend, despite the whispers of a fated duel that would settle the matter once and for all, they have never met face to face. Not until now, in the quiet of a distant island, where the world seems to fade into the mist and the ocean's roar is the only constant, the stage is set for a confrontation that will forever change the course of history. The wind picks up, carrying with it the promise of a storm not of nature, but of men. Two warriors, each at the peak of their craft, each with a heart filled with purpose, will come together on this island to settle their rivalry. But what is at stake is not just their pride or their honor. It is the very soul of the samurai, the future of the sword, and the heart of what it means to be a true warrior. The duel between Kojiro and Musashi is more than just a battle of strength and skill. It is a clash of philosophies, a test of mind and spirit. The long sword against the twin blades, the grace of precision against the wildness of unpredictability, the disciple of tradition against the master of reinvention. But before we step onto that fateful island, let us look back. Let us understand who these men are, not just as swordsmen, but as individuals shaped by their experiences, their beliefs, and their path to mastery. We must understand the art they have devoted their lives to. For in the sword lies more than just blood. It lies the essence of a culture, the spirit of a nation. This is the story of Sasaki Kojiro, the man who became a legend through his unwavering dedication to the sword. A man whose every move was a step toward perfection. A man whose heart beat in rhythm with the very blade he wielded. But it is also the story of Miyamoto Musashi, the wandering swordsman whose philosophy of life and swordsmanship would forever alter the way the world saw the samurai. So, if you are ready to witness the greatest duel in Japanese history, if you are ready to step into the world of the samurai, where honor and death walk hand in hand, then join us. Like, share, and subscribe, for the journey into the heart of this legendary rivalry begins now. We will travel back in time, to a Japan torn by war, where the samurai ruled the land and the sword was the ultimate symbol of power. The Sengoku period, a time when the art of the sword was not just a way of life, but a means of survival. And in this world of conflict and chaos, two men, each driven by their own path, their own philosophy, would rise above all others. Their clash was inevitable, their destinies intertwined. This is the beginning of their story. The story of Sasaki Kojiro and Miyamoto Musashi. Two men, bound by their destiny, who would shape the very art of the sword. A duel that would not only define their legacy but change the course of history itself. This was not just a fight for victory, but a battle for the soul of the samurai, where philosophy and technique would collide in a moment that would echo through the ages. The story of honor, of sacrifice, and of two warriors who would become legends, their names forever etched in the annals of time. The duel that would immortalize their spirits, and the legacy that would live on forever, inspiring generations to come. The sun hung low in the sky as a gentle breeze stirred the trees in the small village, nestled at the foot of the mountains. The sounds of everyday life, mothers calling their children, the chatter of neighbors, the distant thud of wooden tools faded into the background for one young boy. In a quiet corner of the village, Sasaki Kojiro sat, his small hands clutching the wooden practice sword his father had carved for him. He was just a boy, no more than 10 years old, but his eyes were sharp, and his focus was beyond his years. His father, a man who had seen the ways of war firsthand, had always pushed him to be more than just a simple peasant. A boy must be able to protect his family, his honor, and his life, his father would say, voice steady, with a hint of the hardened warrior that he once was. Though he never spoke of his own battles, Kojiro knew that his father had once wielded a sword, perhaps many swords, during his younger years. That day, as Kojiro practiced under the oak tree in their modest yard, something caught his eye. A shadow moved between the branches, its form fleeting like the wind itself. Startled, Kojiro raised his wooden sword defensively, though he knew that the slight tremor in his hands betrayed his readiness. From the trees emerged an old man, his back bent with age, but his step firm and sure. His clothes were worn, and his face was weathered by years of travel. The man's eyes twinkled with mischief. But there was something more, an air of experience, of wisdom, something in the way he carried himself that seemed to speak of things Kojiro could not yet understand. "You practice well, boy," the old man said, his voice soft yet with a hint of authority. "But your stance is weak. You hesitate too much." Kojiro looked up at him, confused but intrigued. "Who are you, old man?" he asked, his voice still shaky with the uncertainty of youth. The man chuckled, a raspy, dry sound. "Who I am is of little importance. What I can teach you, that is what matters." He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on the wooden sword in Kojiro's hands. "You have the form, but you lack the spirit. Let me show you something." Before Kojiro could protest, the old man pulled out his own wooden sword, moving with a fluidity that seemed to defy his age. In a blur of motion, he struck at the boy's practice sword. Kojiro barely managed to block the attack, the force of it sending him staggering back. Again, the old man barked. Kojiro's heart pounded in his chest, but the boy gritted his teeth and regained his stance. The old man moved like a shadow, unpredictable and fast. With every strike, Kojiro felt something awaken within him, a deep, untapped well of strength, something beyond simple muscle memory or practice. The duel was quick, too quick, but in the span of those few moments, the young boy felt a change within him. He could feel the sword becoming an extension of himself, as if it had always belonged in his hand. The old man paused, stepping back and wiping the sweat from his brow. "You have talent, boy," he said with a hint of approval in his voice. "But remember, the sword is not just an object, it is the reflection of your spirit. To be a true swordsman, you must first master yourself." Kojiro stood silently, feeling the weight of the old man's words. He didn't fully understand them yet, but something stirred deep within him, a feeling he couldn't quite name. He bowed low, a gesture of respect, before asking, "Will you teach me?" The old man smiled, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "I will not teach you as a master would teach a disciple. I will show you the way, and then you will walk it on your own. I will guide you, but only if you are willing to learn." Kojiro nodded, his heart pounding with excitement. "I will learn." And so, over the course of weeks and months, the old man returned to the village. Every lesson was like a whisper in the wind, gentle but strong. Kojiro's body became more attuned to the sword. His strikes grew sharper, his movements more fluid. But it was not just technique he learned. It was something far more profound. The old man would often sit with Kojiro beneath the oak tree and recite ancient poems, waka, written by masters long past. Poems that carried the spirit of a warrior's life. The blade, like a fleeting dream, cuts through the night, a reflection of the soul, swift and bright. Each poem was a lesson in itself. The old man spoke of honor, discipline, and the true meaning of strength. He spoke of the heart of the sword and the heart of the warrior. One day, as Kojiro stood alone in the yard, a rustle of feet on the dirt path caught his attention. A local farmer, a man twice his age, approached, holding a long wooden spear in his hands. The man's face was hard, weathered, his hands calloused from years of labor, but there was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a history of battle. The man nodded to Kojiro. "I hear you're the boy who's learned the sword," the farmer said with a grin. "I've fought my share of men with blades. What do you say, boy? Shall we test your skills?" Kojiro, eager to prove himself, nodded without hesitation. He took his wooden sword in hand, his body tense, his mind focused. The duel was quick, faster than anyone could have predicted. Kojiro's movements were sharp, every strike landing with precision. The farmer, though experienced, was slower, unable to keep up with the boy's agility and speed. Within moments, the farmer was disarmed and on the ground, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Impressive," the farmer said, panting as he stood and dusted himself off. "You've got the touch of a true swordsman in you." Kojiro didn't smile. Instead, he stood silently, staring at the wooden sword in his hand, as the old man's words echoed in his mind. "The sword is not just an object, it is the reflection of your spirit." Later that evening, as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the old man found Kojiro by the oak tree, his practice sword resting beside him. The boy stared out at the fading light, his heart filled with a strange mix of pride and confusion. "You did well today," the old man said quietly, sitting beside him. "But remember, the sword is not about proving yourself to others. It is about understanding yourself." Kojiro nodded, though his mind was still racing. "I understand, but is that all?" "No," the old man said with a smile. "It is not enough to simply understand. You must live by it. Your every action, your every thought, must reflect the same discipline you show with your sword. Only then will you truly understand the way of the sword." Kojiro bowed his head, deep in thought. He knew he had just begun a journey, one that would define not only his life but his very soul. And in that moment, beneath the oak tree, he made a vow to himself. He would become the greatest swordsman Japan had ever known. As the seasons shifted and time passed, the lessons continued. The old man became a constant presence in Kojiro's life, each day building upon the last. There was no rush, no end in sight, only the steady rhythm of the blade, the ever-deepening understanding of the sword, and the quiet growth of a boy becoming something more. The lessons were not just about technique. Yes, Kojiro's strikes became sharper, his movements more fluid, but it was the way the sword began to feel that truly changed him. It was as if, over time, it melded with his body, as if he had always known how to move with it, like a part of his own soul. The old man had once told him that the sword reflects the soul, and in these silent moments, Kojiro began to understand that it was not just the physical blade that required mastery, it was his own spirit that must be sharpened. Under the watchful eye of the old man, Kojiro learned more than just combat. He began to meditate, sitting beneath the oak tree and reflecting on the world around him. The air smelled different now, more vivid, more alive. Even the rustling of the leaves, the murmur of the river in the distance, and the sound of birds singing had begun to take on deeper meaning. It was as if he had opened his eyes to the world for the first time. One evening, as the moon rose high, casting a pale light across the village, the old man sat beside Kojiro once more, his voice quiet yet firm. "The blade," he said softly, his words floating in the cool night air, "is more than a weapon. It is the means by which you will discover who you truly are. Do you think you are just a boy with a sword in hand?" Kojiro, eyes fixed on the distant horizon, shook his head slowly. "No, master. I believe I am more than that. I feel as if the sword has become part of me. It speaks to me, like a whisper in the wind." The old man nodded approvingly, a knowing smile crossing his weathered face. "Exactly. But remember, Kojiro, even the best sword is useless without purpose. What is your purpose, boy?" Kojiro hesitated, unsure of the words he needed to express. "To be the greatest swordsman, to defend my family and my honor," the old man sighed, his voice deep with the weight of experience. "You speak of honor and defense, but the true path of a swordsman goes deeper than that. It is not only about defeating others, it is about defeating yourself. It is about becoming the person who can face the deepest darkness and the greatest adversity with grace. It is about living with the sword as your guide, but also living beyond it." Kojiro furrowed his brow, still unsure of the full meaning behind the words. "How do I defeat myself?" The old man smiled, a rare and fleeting expression. "You will know, Kojiro, when the time comes. But for now, let us focus on your journey. Every stroke, every step, every day brings you closer to the man you are meant to be." And so the training continued, with the old man's wisdom and the boy's determination becoming an inseparable force. With each new lesson, Kojiro's understanding of the sword grew deeper, and his connection to it grew stronger. But there was still one thing missing: his first true test. The village had heard rumors of a group of local bandits, men who had terrorized the nearby roads, raiding and stealing from those unfortunate enough to cross their path. They were notorious for their skill with the sword, and the people spoke of their ruthlessness in hushed tones, hoping that someone would rise to challenge them. One day, while Kojiro practiced alone under the oak tree, the old man appeared, his face grave. "It is time, Kojiro," the old man said, his voice heavy with an unspoken meaning. "Time for what, master?" Kojiro asked, his heart suddenly racing. He knew something was about to change. "The bandits," the old man replied. "They will be here within the week. You are ready." Kojiro's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard the stories of these men, and his body tensed at the thought of facing them. But beneath the fear, a fire began to grow. The old man had said he was ready, and Kojiro knew that he could not back down now. "Will you be with me?" Kojiro asked, his voice firm. The old man shook his head slowly. "You must face them alone. The sword will guide you, but you must find your own path. Do not fight with anger or pride, but with understanding. Let the sword become part of you." Kojiro nodded, his resolve solidifying. This would be his trial, the moment when all his lessons would be tested. It was not just about skill, it was about something far deeper. As he stood, sword in hand, he felt his father's words echo in his mind. A boy must be able to protect his family, his honor, and his life. But now, he understood that it was not just protection he sought. It was mastery. Days passed as the village braced itself for the bandits' arrival. Kojiro's mind remained focused, his training intensifying. Every swing of the sword, every breath he took, every movement was a preparation for what was to come. He did not fear the bandits, he feared the failure of his spirit, the inability to live up to the promise he had made to himself. The day finally arrived. Kojiro stood at the village's edge, his wooden sword resting lightly in his hands. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the dirt path. From the distance, he saw them, 3 men on horseback, their faces obscured by the hoods of their cloaks. The bandits had arrived. Kojiro's breath slowed as he watched them approach, his heart steady now, no longer racing. He had trained for this moment his entire life, and though he had never faced men such as these, he knew in his heart that it wasn't the sword that would define him. It was his spirit. As the bandits dismounted, one of them stepped forward with a mocking grin. "So you are the boy they speak of? The one with the sword?" Kojiro said nothing, his gaze unwavering, his stance firm. The man chuckled. "Very well, little warrior. Show us what you've got." Kojiro tightened his grip on the wooden sword, his eyes narrowing. The duel was about to begin. And in that moment, Kojiro knew this was just the beginning. The sky had already dimmed when Kojiro returned from the confrontation with the bandits. His body ached from the brief but intense clash, but it was not the physical strain that left him unsettled. It was the weight of the lesson he had just learned. The bandits were skilled, but they lacked the discipline, the spirit that Kojiro had been taught to seek. His wooden sword had cut through their ranks, but his heart felt heavier than ever before. Was the sword merely a tool to fight? Or was it something deeper? The old man had not been there to witness the battle, but Kojiro knew that his training, his understanding of the sword, would have been incomplete without his guidance. That night, as he sat beneath the oak tree, his mind turned to the lessons the old man had taught him, and a question began to form in his heart. What is the true way of the sword? It was the next day, while Kojiro was practicing his strikes in the yard, that the old man returned. His steps were quiet, his presence as calming as the wind that rustled the leaves of the oak. He watched Kojiro for a moment, his eyes observing, not judging. "You fought well against the bandits," the old man said, his voice calm as always. "But you fought them as a warrior, not as a swordsman. There is a difference." And Kojiro stopped mid-strike and turned to him, confusion etched on his young face. "A warrior? But isn't a swordsman just a warrior who fights with a blade?" The old man smiled softly, walking over to where Kojiro stood. "No, Kojiro. A swordsman is more than just a warrior. A swordsman is one who seeks to understand the soul of the sword. To wield the blade is to wield a part of yourself. It is a path that requires more than just skill. It requires balance, humility, and mastery over your own spirit." Kojiro lowered his sword, feeling the weight of the old man's words. "But how can I master the sword if I do not fight with it?" The old man's gaze softened, and he gestured toward the horizon. "A true swordsman does not seek to fight. He seeks to understand, to learn. The sword is not just for battle, it is for discipline, for growth, for peace. To fight is to lose oneself in anger and pride, but the sword, when wielded with a calm mind and a peaceful heart, becomes a reflection of the inner self." Kojiro stood silently for a moment, contemplating the old man's words. They were different from what he had always imagined. He had always thought that strength, speed, and victory were the true marks of a swordsman. But now, he began to see that the sword was not simply a tool for conquering opponents. It was a path to understanding oneself. The old man seemed to sense Kojiro's growing curiosity. "You are ready for a new lesson," he said, his voice low and steady. "It is time for you to study the forms of the sword, the art of kenjutsu." Kenjutsu was not simply about swinging the sword. It was about controlling the body, the mind, and the breath. The movements were intricate, precise, and deliberate. Every step was a calculated motion, every strike a testament to the swordsman's mastery over his own being. For the next several months, Kojiro's training was no longer about speed or strength. It was about control. The old man taught him the foundational kata, the formalized movements that represented the principles of combat. These were not just physical exercises, but spiritual practices. Each kata had a name, a meaning, and a purpose. The old man explained them as more than just drills, they were lessons in life, each movement reflecting a principle of the warrior's way. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the mountains, the old man stood before Kojiro, his sword drawn. The air around them seemed to hold its breath. "Follow my movements, Kojiro," the old man said. "Let your mind become the blade. Feel each step. With every motion, you will learn." Kojiro gripped his sword tightly, his muscles tense with anticipation. As the old man began to move, Kojiro followed. The form was simple, but the fluidity of the old man's motion was something beyond the boy's understanding. Each movement was a statement of intent, a perfect union of mind and body. There was no hesitation, no thought of victory or defeat, only the movement itself, the sword's edge cutting through the air in a precise dance of balance and grace. The old man's voice broke through Kojiro's concentration. Kenjutsu is not about fighting. It is about understanding. When you understand the sword, you understand yourself. When you understand yourself, you can master the world. Kojiro followed the movements, his focus deepening with every strike, every step. His body began to move without thought, as if it had always known the motions. But more than the physical movements, Kojiro began to feel a quiet stillness within himself. A peace that had been absent in the heat of battle now filled him, and it was as if the sword had become a part of him, an extension of his very being. The old man spoke once more, his words soft but carrying the weight of years of wisdom. "The sword does not belong to you, Kojiro. You belong to the sword. It will test you. It will teach you, and in the end, it will lead you to your true self." Kojiro's heart raced, but this time, it was not out of fear or anticipation. It was out of a deep, growing understanding of what the sword truly meant. It was not a weapon, it was a guide, a teacher, a path. The sword would show him his strengths, but also his weaknesses. It would shape him into something more than just a warrior. As the night fell, the old man turned to Kojiro, his eyes filled with approval. "The sword, Kojiro, is a way of life. It is the way of the spirit, and you have begun to walk that path." Kojiro stood in the fading light of dusk, his wooden sword held firmly in his hands. But now, it felt different. The weight of it, the smoothness of the handle, and the balance of the blade were no longer just physical sensations. There was something deeper at work. The old man's words, his movements, his philosophy, they had opened something within Kojiro, something that had lain dormant until now. The sword was no longer just a tool of combat. It was an extension of his spirit, a means to understand his very soul. The old man stood beside him, his posture still as straight as it had been when he first arrived. His sword rested lightly in his hands, the tip just touching the earth as he gazed at Kojiro. There was a silent understanding between them. Kojiro had learned something important that evening, but the lesson was not over. It had only just begun. "Kojiro," the old man spoke, his voice low and steady. "When you fight, do you think you are only fighting your opponent?" Kojiro, still catching his breath from the kata, looked at him, his mind already swirling with the implications of the question. I suppose I always thought I was fighting the person in front of me, their sword, their strength." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had expected the answer. "And yet, you must understand, Kojiro, that the true fight is not with the sword, nor with the opponent. It is with yourself. The sword merely reveals who you are. It shows your flaws, your weaknesses, your fears. You cannot escape them when you hold it. It is only when you understand yourself that you will truly understand the sword." Kojiro was silent for a moment, his heart heavy with the weight of the old man's words. He thought back to his first battle with the bandits, the fear he had felt, the surge of anger that had fueled his strikes, the way he had rushed into battle without thinking. He had thought his victory was a testament to his strength, but now it felt hollow. Was it truly victory if his mind and heart had been so unsettled? The old man continued, sensing Kojiro's growing realization. You must train not just your body, but your mind and spirit. Only then will the sword become an extension of your will, not just your strength. Only then will you truly become a swordsman. Kojiro nodded, his hands gripping his wooden sword more tightly, as though he could somehow channel all his thoughts into the blade itself. But the old man had already begun moving again, his graceful movements sweeping through the air with ease. This time, there was no hesitation in Kojiro's actions. He followed the old man, matching each strike with precision, feeling each movement not just in his body but deep in his soul. The forms of Kenjutsu, the kata, were not mere exercises. They were meditations, practices that forced Kojiro to face himself. His mind was always racing at first, thoughts of power, of mastery, of the sword as a tool for battle, but with each repetition of the kata, those thoughts slowly faded. What was left was a kind of stillness, a quiet focus that Kojiro had never known. As the old man moved through the kata, he spoke once more, his voice blending with the rhythm of their movements. The way of the sword is like water. It is not rigid. It does not fight against its surroundings. It flows, it adapts, it seeks balance. When you understand this, you will begin to understand the true way of Kenjutsu. Kojiro's breathing slowed as he mirrored the old man's motions, feeling a sense of unity with the world around him. The rustling of the leaves, the chirping of birds in the distance, all of it seemed to fade into the background, leaving only the sword, his breath, and his thoughts. He was no longer just a boy with a weapon. He was a man learning to understand the very essence of the sword and of himself. The night air grew cooler, and the stars began to emerge in the sky. The old man stopped his movements, lowering his sword. Kojiro followed suit, his body still humming with the quiet energy of the kata. "You have learned much today," the old man said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "But there is still much for you to understand. The sword is not something you simply wield. It is something you must become." Kojiro lowered his sword, still feeling the weight of the old man's words. He wanted to ask more, wanted to know how he could fully understand what the old man meant, but he knew that the journey was far from over. He would need to continue practicing, continue refining both his body and mind, and, most importantly, continue seeking balance within himself. And so, each day, Kojiro devoted himself to his training, rising before dawn and practicing his forms beneath the oak tree. The sun would climb higher in the sky, and the world around him would continue its rhythm. But Kojiro was no longer just a boy in a quiet village. He was a student of the sword, a student of life, and the path ahead would take him further than he ever imagined. One evening, as Kojiro practiced the kata alone under the oak tree, he felt a presence approach. It was the old man, his steps silent as ever. "You are improving, Kojiro," the old man said, watching as the boy finished the form with graceful precision. "But remember, it is not the speed with which you strike, nor the strength with which you fight. It is the quiet within you that will guide your hand." Kojiro, now deeply absorbed in the practice, nodded slowly. "I understand, master." The old man smiled, his eyes twinkling with something akin to approval. "Good. Then you are beginning to walk the path." With those words, the old man turned to leave, disappearing into the twilight shadows. Kojiro stood still for a moment, his wooden sword still raised in the final position of the kata. He closed his eyes and breathed deeply, feeling the weight of the sword settle in his hands, feeling the connection between his body and the blade, feeling that the two had truly become one. The path was long, and the road ahead would not be easy. But Kojiro had taken his first true steps on the way of the sword, and with each step, he was one movement closer to understanding the soul of the sword and his own. Kojiro had come a long way from the young boy who had once gripped his wooden sword in trembling hands beneath the oak tree. The lessons of the old man had transformed him, shaping not only his body but his spirit. Through the kata, the deep meditation, and the quiet self-reflection, Kojiro had learned the true way of the sword. His strikes were now fluid, precise, and above all calm. He no longer fought with anger or haste. The sword had become an extension of his mind, a reflection of his inner balance. And yet, despite all his training, Kojiro knew that there was one last test, one final trial, that would show him the true extent of his progress. It had been months since his last battle with the bandits, and his name had begun to spread across the region. Not only would it test his physical skill, but it would also test the depth of his understanding of the sword. He had trained for this moment, but he had also prepared his mind. For the true test of a swordsman was not merely in the strength of his arm, it was in the calmness of his heart. The sun hung low in the sky as Kojiro stood at the edge of a quiet clearing, the wind rustling the leaves in the trees around him. He had arrived early, as he always did before a duel, to center himself, to prepare his mind. This duel was not a mere contest of skill, it was a meeting of philosophies, a clash of the old ways with the new. The clearing was empty save for the two figures, Kojiro, and standing opposite him, Saito Ryu. Ryu was a man in his 50s, his hair long and silver, his face sharp and unyielding. His presence was commanding, his posture immaculate, and his eyes, dark and focused, held the weight of years spent mastering the sword. Ryu was dressed in the traditional robes of a swordmaster, and his wooden katana was held loosely in his hands. Yet the air around him seemed to hum with controlled energy. Kojiro stepped forward, his wooden sword now in hand. He stood tall, calm, and unwavering. Oh! There was a long pause, the air thick with anticipation. And then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Ryu raised his sword, his body fluidly transitioning into a stance. Kojiro mirrored him, his wooden sword held steady, his feet planted firmly on the ground. The world seemed to quiet as the two swordsmen stood facing each other, one a master of the old way, and the other a disciple who had learned to merge the ancient art with a new understanding. The first strike came without warning. Ryu moved like lightning, his wooden katana a blur as it sliced through the air toward Kojiro's chest. But Kojiro was ready. He shifted his weight, his body flowing effortlessly into the defensive stance he had mastered through countless hours of training. His blade intercepted Ryu's with a soft clink, the clash of wood against wood ringing through the clearing. The force of the strike sent a ripple through Kojiro's body, but he stood firm, his mind calm, his movements controlled. There was no panic, no anger. He did not seek to overpower Ryu. Instead, he simply responded with balance, with poise, allowing Ryu's energy to pass through him without resistance. Ryu stepped back, eyes narrowing. "Interesting," he murmured, the first sign of surprise in his voice. He attacked again, faster this time, his strikes more fierce, more urgent. But Kojiro remained composed. With every move, he seemed to glide through the air, his strikes smooth and precise, his body flowing like water, never resisting, only redirecting. For every strike Ryu made, Kojiro met it with a counter that was not about strength, but about timing and understanding. Each movement was like the brushstroke of a master painter, fluid, deliberate, and effortless. As the duel progressed, the gap between the two men began to widen. Ryu, the great master, was still formidable, but Kojiro's calm, almost zen-like approach to combat allowed him to flow around the older man's strikes with uncanny ease. There was no rush, no desire to prove anything. It was not about winning. It was about becoming one with the sword, one with the moment. The air around them seemed to hum with energy as the duel reached its peak. Ryu's strikes grew fiercer, his frustration mounting as he realized that Kojiro was not just matching him, he was moving with him, anticipating every move, every thought. There was no anger in Kojiro's eyes, no aggression in his stance. His movements were simply the natural response of one who had truly mastered the way of the sword. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ryu stopped. His sword hovered in the air as he took a step back, his chest heaving with exertion. He stared at Kojiro, a hint of admiration now in his gaze. "You have truly mastered the sword, Kojiro," Ryu said, his voice filled with a quiet respect. "You fought not with strength, but with understanding. Your spirit has become one with your blade." Kojiro lowered his sword, his chest rising and falling in steady breaths. "Thank you, Master Ryu," he said, his voice calm, his heart at peace. "I have learned much from you." Ryu smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You have not only learned the sword, Kojiro, you have learned the way of life. Remember this: when the sword is in your hands, It is not your strength that will guide you, but your spirit. A true swordsman fights only when necessary, and even then, he does so with understanding, not anger. Kojiro nodded, his heart filled with gratitude for the lesson he had received. The duel had not been about victory or defeat, it had been about growth, about understanding the deeper nature of the sword and the quiet power that came from mastering one's own spirit. As the first light of morning broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing, Kojiro and Master Ryu stood in the aftermath of their duel. The sounds of the forest birds chirping, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed to return to their normal rhythm. But for Kojiro, the world had changed. He felt as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a deeper understanding of the sword, one that transcended the physical and reached into the realm of the spirit. Ryu, still standing tall despite his years, lowered his wooden katana and walked toward Kojiro. His movements were deliberate, as though the sword had not only tested Kojiro's body but his mind as well. "You have done more than match me, Kojiro," Ryu said, his voice calm but laden with respect. "You have shown me something few warriors ever truly grasp. The sword does not belong to those who seek power, but to those who seek harmony. And you, young swordsman, have found it." Kojiro stood, his wooden sword now hanging loosely in his hand. The sounds of the forest birds chirping, the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze seemed to return to their normal rhythm. But for Kojiro, the world had changed. He felt as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a deeper understanding of the sword, one that transcended the physical and reached into the realm of the spirit. Ryu, still standing tall despite his years, lowered his wooden katana and walked toward Kojiro. Ryu smiled, his eyes gleaming with approval. "You speak wisdom beyond your years, Kojiro. The sword can only reflect what is within. Your calmness, your understanding of the flow not just of the fight, but of life itself has proven that you are on the path." The two stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their words settling between them. Ryu's gaze drifted to the horizon, and Kojiro followed it, taking in the vast expanse of nature that surrounded them. His heart was calm, but his mind still buzzed with the energy of the duel. He had faced a master, perhaps the greatest swordsman in the land, and though his body was tired, his spirit felt lighter than ever before. "I don't know if I'm worthy of such praise," Kojiro said, his voice soft but sincere. "I only followed what you taught me. I've been so focused on the sword, on winning, but I realize now that it is not the blade that defines a swordsman. It's the heart, the spirit." He thought back to his early days, the endless battles with bandits, the thirst for victory, the anger that sometimes clouded his mind. But now, after months of training, after learning to still his mind and let the sword become a part of him, he realized that the sword was not something to be wielded out of desire or pride. It was something to be respected, a tool for understanding, a guide to inner peace. "I have much to learn still," Kojiro said, looking at Ryu with newfound clarity. "But I am ready. I will walk this path as you have." Ryu placed a hand on Kojiro's shoulder, his grip firm yet gentle. "The path is long, Kojiro, but you are ready to walk it, not as a warrior seeking to conquer, but as a swordsman seeking to understand." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the land, Kojiro sat beneath the same oak tree where he had first practiced with the old man so many months ago. His wooden sword rested on the ground beside him, and he closed his eyes, letting the quiet of the world wash over him. The lessons of Master Ryu still lingered in his thoughts. The sword reflects your spirit. The true fight is not with the opponent, but within yourself. These words, simple yet profound, had changed the way Kojiro viewed not only the sword but life itself. He could still feel the fluidity of the kata, the grace with which he had moved, and how each step, each strike had been a meditation, a moment of understanding that transcended combat. It was then that he remembered a poem the old man had taught him long ago. "In my youth," Ryu continued, his voice almost a whisper, "I sought strength above all else. I believed the sword was the only way to define a man. But I was wrong. Strength without understanding, without peace, is a hollow thing. It is only when you see beyond the blade, when you understand the heart of the sword, that you will truly understand yourself." Kojiro nodded, feeling the truth of Ryu's words resonate within him. The sword was not a weapon to dominate the world around him. It was a way to conquer his own inner turmoil, to achieve a balance that allowed him to face life's challenges with clarity and calmness. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Kojiro stood up, his body weary but his spirit invigorated. He had faced the greatest challenge of his life, and had come out not just victorious, but enlightened. The duel with Master Ryu had not been about winning or losing, it had been about learning, about growing, about understanding the true nature of the sword and his place in the world. Kojiro turned back toward the village, his wooden sword resting lightly in his hand, no longer a symbol of battle, but of peace. He had walked the path of the sword, and while the journey was far from over, he felt ready for whatever lay ahead. While Kojiro's name had begun to spread across the land, and his mastery of the sword was admired by those who had witnessed his skills firsthand, there was another name that hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. It was a name whispered in the halls of swordmasters, among scholars and warriors alike: Miyamoto Musashi. Unlike the formal duels and training that defined Kojiro's path, Musashi was an outsider, a man who rejected the conventions of the sword, choosing instead to forge his own way. While Kojiro had learned to adapt the teachings of his masters, Musashi had no masters to learn from. He was a loner, a wanderer, constantly seeking perfection on a path that seemed to exist outside of time itself. His philosophy of swordsmanship was radically different from those who followed traditional schools, and yet it was perhaps the most powerful approach of all. Musashi was not born into a noble family, or one steeped in the ways of the sword. His origins were humble, his childhood marked by hardship. Born in the late 1500s during Japan's Sengoku period, Musashi was the son of a low-ranking samurai, but his early years were filled with violence, loss, and abandonment. His father, a skilled swordsman in his own right, left him at a young age, a memory that would shape Musashi's entire life. The death of his mother left him even more isolated, and soon he found himself living on the fringes of society, far from the comforts of family or tradition. It was during this time, in the solitude of his youth, that Musashi began to learn the sword not through formal training, but through necessity. There was no school, no dojo, where he could learn the ancient forms of kenjutsu. Instead, he fought against older, more experienced men, against masters who believed in the conventional way of the blade. He fought because he had no other choice. But in every battle, he found himself understanding the sword in a way that no traditional school ever could teach. Musashi's approach was simple but revolutionary: adaptability. While other swordsmen fixed themselves on a specific style, a specific kata, Musashi understood that the sword was not about rigid rules or the mimicry of ancient techniques. The true mastery of the sword came from being able to adapt to any situation, any opponent, and any moment. The sword was not a set of movements. It was a fluid, living extension of the self that changed in accordance with the world around it. And thus, Musashi rejected the traditional schools, creating his own unique approach to swordsmanship, which he would later call Niten Ichi Ryu, the two heavens, one school. This method was not simply about learning one style of fighting. It was about mastering the art of using two swords, one in each hand, something that was almost unheard of at the time. Musashi believed that using two swords allowed him to control the flow of a battle in ways that others could not even comprehend. His two-sword style was born not from the desire for fame, but from the belief that the sword was a tool for survival, a tool for adapting to any challenge. By using both swords, one for offense and one for defense, Musashi had the ability to keep his opponents off balance, to overwhelm them with speed and unpredictability. It was not about strength or power. It was about control and fluidity. Musashi moved with such precision that his strikes became a blur to those who tried to follow him. His opponents never knew where the next strike would come from, or how it would land. Though Musashi was constantly on the move, traveling from one province to another, his reputation grew steadily. His duels were legendary. He had never been defeated, and each victory only added to the myth surrounding him. But despite his growing fame, Musashi was not interested in recognition or accolades. Unlike Kojiro, who had trained under masters and followed a path of tradition. Musashi's path was one of personal discovery and self-reliance. His mind was constantly at war with itself, driven by the desire for perfection, but never satisfied with what he had achieved. He would train in solitude, pushing himself to new heights, exploring new ways to wield the sword. It was not the victory over others that he sought, it was the victory over himself. He was a man in search of something greater, something more elusive than mere mastery of the blade. He sought the essence of the sword, the truth behind the technique. One evening, as Musashi sat by a quiet stream, the sound of the water flowing softly beside him, he reflected on the many battles he had fought, the countless men he had faced. His heart, despite all the victories, still felt empty. It was not the emptiness of defeat, but the emptiness of being constantly in search of something that no duel, no victory could fill. In the quiet, his thoughts turned inward. He closed his eyes and allowed himself to breathe deeply, his mind searching for the answer to a question he had carried with him for years. What is the true nature of the sword? And then, as if the answer had always been there, a realization dawned upon him. The sword, in all its forms, in all its techniques, was not a tool of destruction. It was a means of understanding. It was a mirror, one that reflected the soul of its wielder. The sword was a path, a way of life that led not to victory, but to self-realization. As Musashi continued to travel, his reputation grew, but he remained an enigma to those who sought to understand him. He would fight, win, and move on. No fanfare, no ceremony, just the next duel, the next challenge. For Musashi, the sword was not about fame or glory, it was about the journey. He would later write down his thoughts in a work known as the Book of Five Rings, a text that would become one of the most important philosophical works in martial arts history. It was a book not just about swordsmanship, but about life itself, the philosophy of adaptability, of balance, of seeking the truth beyond the surface. The years passed, and Musashi's name became a symbol of both awe and mystery. His path was one of constant movement, never staying in one place for long. He was a man who existed beyond the confines of tradition, yet the world around him seemed to be drawn to him, captivated by the enigma that was his life. His mastery was undeniable, and his unique approach to swordsmanship had become the subject of much conversation among those who studied the blade. However, despite the respect he garnered, Musashi remained a solitary figure. His interactions with other swordmasters were brief, and often they were filled with tension. While Kojiro had trained under the guidance of others and followed a path rooted in the ancient teachings of Kenjutsu, Musashi had never been bound by anyone's teachings. His life was one of constant evolution, a search for answers that only he could provide for himself. For Musashi, there was no final destination. There was only the endless journey, the relentless quest for perfection. He trained in the mornings, sometimes alone by the river, other times in the solitude of the mountains, where the only sound was the swish of his blade cutting through the air. He trained not to defeat others, but to conquer himself, to eliminate the doubt, the fear, the ego that often clouded the mind of even the most skilled swordsman. One afternoon, as he sat near the edge of a river, his thoughts turned inward again, and he reflected on the nature of his journey. What had he truly sought all these years? Was it mastery? Was it fame? Or had it been the essence of the sword all along, something far beyond technique, beyond winning or losing? In the stillness of his thoughts, Musashi had an epiphany. The sword was not merely an instrument to dominate others. It was a tool for self-realization, a way to peel back the layers of the ego and the mind, revealing what lay beneath, the truth of who one truly was. The sword was both a reflection of the world around him and the depths of his own heart. With this realization came peace, a quiet understanding that would guide his steps going forward. But Musashi's reputation had long preceded him, and despite his preference for solitude, his name had spread far and wide. It wasn't long before other swordmasters sought him out, eager to challenge him, to test the limits of his philosophy. One such swordsman, a man named Oda Nobuhiro, was a self-proclaimed master of the traditional Kenjutsu schools. His skill was impeccable, his strength formidable, and his ego just as large. He had heard of Musashi's victories, of his strange two-sword style, and felt it was time to show the world that tradition was the true path to sword mastery. Nobuhiro had heard that Musashi was a rogue, someone who fought outside the rules. But in his mind, the classics, the ancient techniques of kenjutsu, held the key to true power. So, with a heart full of pride, Nobuhiro sought out Musashi, determined to defeat him, to prove that his traditional ways were superior. He found Musashi one quiet evening on the outskirts of a small village where Musashi was sitting, as he often did, by a river. Nobuhiro challenged him immediately, his voice sharp with arrogance. "Musashi," he called out, "I challenge you to a duel. You are nothing but a rogue swordsman, creating your own ways with no respect for tradition. Let me show you what it means to follow the true path of the sword." Musashi did not respond at first. He simply rose slowly to his feet, his body fluid, as if his movements were drawn from the very essence of the earth itself. His hand brushed lightly against his sword, feeling its weight, not as a weapon, but as an extension of himself. He did not need to speak. His calmness, his focus, this was his response. Nobuhiro, frustrated by Musashi's silence, drew his sword, stepping forward with the air of someone who believed victory was assured. "You will see the superiority of my sword," he said, his voice filled with self-assurance. Musashi watched him quietly. He did not need to rush, for he knew that speed and power would not determine the outcome. It would be his ability to read Nobuhiro's movements, to understand his intentions, that would win the fight. The duel began. Nobuhiro attacked with precision, his strikes fast and forceful, but Musashi's movements were fluid and unpredictable. He wielded his two swords not as weapons of offense, but as an extension of his perception. One sword was used to block, the other to create openings, an intricate dance of defense and attack. Nobuhiro struck again and again, his frustration growing as Musashi dodged, blocked, and deflected with calmness that seemed to flow like water around his attacks. Nobuhiro's anger made his strikes more erratic, more wild, and in his haste, he exposed a weakness. Musashi saw it instantly, and with a swift, graceful motion, he disarmed Nobuhiro, sending his sword flying from his hand. The two men stood facing each other, the silence hanging heavy in the air. Nobuhiro, his chest heaving with exhaustion and disbelief, looked at Musashi, his pride shattered. How did you do that?" he asked, his voice cracking. Musashi's expression remained calm. "You were too eager to defeat me. The sword is not a means of showing power. It is a reflection of who you are. You lost because your spirit was clouded with pride, while mine remains still." Nobuhiro dropped to his knees, humbled, realizing that Musashi had not defeated him with strength, but with understanding. The duel had not been about victory or defeat. It had been a test of their spirits, and Musashi's had proved stronger. "You fight with two swords," Nobuhiro said, his voice quiet now. "What is the meaning of this?" Musashi paused, then replied, "The sword is not about rigidity. It is about adaptability. With two swords, I can control the flow of the battle, offense and defense, balanced together." It was a book not just about swordsmanship, but about life itself, the philosophy of adaptability, of balance, of seeking the truth beyond the surface. The years passed, and Musashi's name became a symbol of both awe and mystery. His path was one of constant movement, never staying in one place for long. He was a man who existed beyond the confines of tradition, yet the world around him seemed to be drawn to him, captivated by the enigma that was his life. It was a book not just about swordsmanship, but about life itself, the philosophy of adaptability, of balance, of seeking the truth beyond the surface. The years passed, and Musashi's name became a symbol of both awe and mystery. His path was one of constant movement, never staying in one place for long. He was a man who existed beyond the confines of tradition, yet the world around him seemed to be drawn to him, captivated by the enigma that was his life. Chapter 5. Kojiro versus Musashi. The rivalry begins. The reputation of Sasaki Kojiro had now spread far and wide. His precision with the sword, his calmness in combat, and his unshakable discipline had made him a legend in his own right. Everywhere he went, he was sought after not just for his skills but for the aura of understanding and grace that he carried with every movement. His reputation was a testament to the traditional way of the sword, mastery through discipline, through training, and through the path of the samurai. Meanwhile, far across the land, another name echoed through the halls of swordmasters and warriors. Miyamoto Musashi, a figure as mysterious as he was renowned, had carved out a legend of his own. His unorthodox style, his use of two swords, his adaptability, his deep philosophical approach to combat set him apart from any traditional swordsman. Musashi's path had been one of isolation, self-discovery, and battle, while Kojiro's had been shaped by discipline and the teachings of masters. Despite the different paths they had taken, one thing was clear. A meeting between these two swordsmen was inevitable. The first whispers of their rivalry came in hushed conversations among scholars and warriors. In one dojo, a samurai elder spoke of Kojiro's graceful strikes, the way he seemed to flow through the air, each movement precise and measured. In another, a young warrior's eyes widened as he described Musashi's unpredictable style, how Musashi's strikes seemed to come from places no one expected, how his use of two swords turned every battle into a dance of chaos and control. It wasn't long before the comparison between the two became unavoidable. Kojiro, the embodiment of tradition and grace, and Musashi, the wild force of nature who seemed to bend the very laws of combat to his will. Both men, with their legendary skills, had attracted the attention of warriors and masters alike. But the two men, despite their growing fame, had never crossed paths. Each knew of the other, each was aware of the challenge the other presented, but fate had kept them apart. Kojiro sat in a small, quiet village one evening, his wooden sword resting against the wall as he cleaned his gear. A group of travelers had come through, and among them was an old merchant who carried word from distant lands. "Ah, Kojiro-san," the merchant had said, sitting beside him. "You are truly famous, my friend. There is talk of your skill everywhere. But there is one name I hear more often than your own." Kojiro looked up, intrigued. "Who is this man?" The merchant leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Miyamoto Musashi. He is said to wield two swords. Some say he has never been defeated. His style is unlike any other. They say he is unbeatable." The word struck Kojiro like a sudden gust of wind. He had heard of Musashi, of course. Whispers of his victories, his strange style, and his solitary path had reached even his ears. But it was one thing to hear of him. It was another to be told that this was the man who might be his rival, the man who might challenge everything Kojiro had worked for. "I will meet him one day," Kojiro said quietly, the words feeling like a vow, though he did not know when or where that meeting would happen. Far to the west, Musashi sat alone in a small hut overlooking a mountain range, his wooden katana resting beside him. His thoughts were often clouded with the same question: who was Sasaki Kojiro? He had heard the rumors. Musashi had never been one to concern himself with the fame of others, but the mention of Kojiro's name had intrigued him. The stories were always the same Kojiro, the swordsman who struck with precision and grace, a master of technique, a man who embodied the tradition of the sword. Musashi was not one to follow tradition. He had walked his own path, created his own school, and trained himself in isolation. The idea of a man so tied to tradition intrigued him, yet left him unsettled. Musashi believed in adaptability. He believed that the sword was not something to be molded by the past, but something that must evolve with the present. One evening, after finishing a long session of practice, Musashi sat by his fire, watching the flames dance in the hearth. He thought of Kojiro, his form and his style, and something within him stirred. Was this the man who could truly challenge him? His hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, his thoughts turning inward. There is only one way to find out. The stage for their meeting was set in the most unexpected of ways. News spread that the two swordsmen would meet, but not in the typical arena of battle. It would be a confrontation arranged by a third party, an invitation issued for a duel that would attract warriors from all over the country. It was a cold morning when Kojiro received word from a messenger. The message was brief and to the point. "Miyamoto Musashi has agreed to meet you. A duel will take place in 1 week on the island of Funajima." Kojiro did not hesitate. He knew that this was not just a battle. It was a culmination of everything he had learned. It was not about proving his strength. It was about testing his understanding of the sword, of life, of himself. He had trained for this moment. But now, standing on the precipice of fate, he felt the weight of what was to come. In a small, secluded village, Musashi sat cross-legged, reading through his personal notes. He had already begun to strategize, as he always did. There would be no formalities, no rules. It would be a fight where only the spirit would determine the victor. As the time drew near, Musashi felt the stirrings of something familiar anticipation. Yes, but also something deeper. A curiosity about this man who represented everything he had rejected in his own path. Kojiro was a swordsman of tradition, and Musashi had always prided himself on being an outsider, someone who fought against the established ways. What would happen when these two philosophies collided? The day before the duel, Kojiro stood at the edge of a lake, watching the mist roll across the water. His mind was calm, as it always was before battle. But deep inside, a question lingered. Would this duel change the course of his life? Would he learn something from Musashi that he had not yet understood? The evening breeze tousled his hair, and he closed his eyes, letting the cool air fill his lungs. There was no fear, no anger, only clarity. Tomorrow, he would meet Musashi, and the rivalry that had built slowly over the years would finally come to fruition. It was not about victory or defeat, it was about something deeper. It was about understanding. The night before the duel, as the moon cast a soft light over the quiet lake, Kojiro felt a profound sense of stillness settle within him. The tension that had built up over the years, the stories, the whispers, the comparisons, now seemed distant. The rivalry, once filled with fire and competition, had become something else entirely. Kojiro's thoughts turned inward, as they often did in the moments before a battle. He focused on his breathing, letting the rhythm of the world around him fade into the background. The sharpness of his thoughts, the clarity of his mind, were the fruits of years of training not just of the body but of the spirit. His sword, the extension of his will, would speak for him tomorrow, just as it had always done. He thought back to the old man's teachings, the lessons that had shaped him into the swordsman he had become. The sword is not the blade, but the mind that guides it. Kojiro had learned that over the years, understanding that true mastery came from a place deeper than just technique. His strikes were precise, but it was the calmness within him that allowed the blade to find its mark. Tomorrow, he thought, I will meet Musashi on the battlefield, but it will not be a battle of mere strength. It will be a test of spirit, of understanding. Meanwhile, across the land, Musashi sat in a dimly lit room, the flickering flame of a lantern casting long shadows against the walls. He had spent the last few days in seclusion, preparing for the duel, with a kind of focused intensity that matched his usual solitary nature. His thoughts were clear but sharp. He didn't need to know who Kojiro was in the traditional sense. What mattered was how Kojiro wielded his sword. Musashi had heard of the young man's reputation, his precision, his calm demeanor, but that was only part of the equation. Musashi had long since rejected the idea of rigid tradition, of being confined by schools of thought that had existed for centuries. Naiten Ichi-ryu, his two-sword style, was based on adaptability, on creating opportunities where none existed, on bending the rules when necessary. It was not about proving his strength. It was about testing his understanding of the sword, of life, of himself. He had trained for this moment. But now, standing on the precipice of fate, he felt the weight of what was to come. In a small, secluded village, Musashi sat cross-legged, reading through his personal notes. He had already begun to strategize, as he always did. There would be no formalities, no rules. It would be a fight where only the spirit would determine the victor. What would happen when these two philosophies collided? The day before the duel, Kojiro stood at the edge of a lake, watching the mist roll across the water. His mind was calm, as it always was before battle. But deep inside, a question lingered. Would this duel change the course of his life? Would he learn something from Musashi that he had not yet understood? The evening breeze tousled his hair, and he closed his eyes, letting the cool air fill his lungs. He had always believed that a true swordsman was not bound by the weight of tradition, but was free to create his own path. Tomorrow, he thought, would be different. This duel would be a test. not just of skill, but of their philosophies. Kojiro's reliance on precision, his dedication to tradition Musashi, would challenge all of that with his fluid, unpredictable style. The only thing that mattered now was the duel, nothing else could intrude. As he approached the center of the field, he saw Musashi waiting. The man stood alone, his posture relaxed but alert, his two swords resting easily at his sides. His calm demeanor was in stark contrast to the rumors that had surrounded him. There was no wildness in his eyes, no signs of aggression. Kojiro bowed slightly in greeting, his eyes never leaving Musashi. "Musashi," he said, his voice steady, "I have heard much of your skill. It is an honor to meet you." Musashi nodded, acknowledging the greeting, though his expression remained unreadable. "I am not here for honor," he replied quietly. "I am here to understand. The sword is a reflection of the soul, and today we will both see what lies within." Kojiro didn't respond, but his mind sharpened at Musashi's words. This wasn't just about skill nor tradition, it was a deeper test. The sword is a reflection of the soul. It was the same lesson the old man had taught him, but here it was echoed in Musashi's words. A reminder that the duel would be as much a battle of minds as it was of blades. As the duel began, the two men stood in the center of the rocky field, silent except for the sound of the wind. Neither moved at first, as if measuring each other, testing the air. Then, with a sudden fluid motion, Musashi attacked. His two swords came to life, one slicing through the air toward Kojiro's head, the other aimed lower at his torso. Kojiro's movements were precise, as always, his body flowing into a defensive stance that seemed almost effortless. His sword met Musashi's with a soft, ringing clash, the force of the blow resonating through the air. But it wasn't the impact of the swords that caught Kojiro's attention, it was the way Musashi's second sword followed immediately, without hesitation, slicing toward his unprotected side. Kojiro had anticipated the first strike, but Musashi's fluidity caught him off guard. He twisted his body, parrying the second sword just in time. But Musashi was already moving again, his steps unpredictable, a dance of offense and defense that left no room for Kojiro to settle into his rhythm. The two swordsmen continued to clash, each strike a flash of motion, Kojiro's precise and measured, Musashi's fluid and unpredictable. Kojiro's strikes were like a well-composed piece of music, each note perfectly placed. But Musashi's style was chaotic, a storm of motion that never settled into a predictable pattern. As the duel progressed, Kojiro began to understand something he hadn't before. Musashi wasn't just trying to defeat him. He wasn't trying to prove superiority. Musashi was testing him. The strikes weren't meant to land, they were meant to challenge Kojiro's focus, his adaptability, his ability to remain calm in the face of chaos. For the first time, Kojiro felt himself slipping, not in terms of technique, but in terms of his mind. Musashi's relentless pace was pushing him beyond the limits of precision he had so carefully cultivated. He could feel his breath quicken, his focus narrowing. The calmness he had worked so hard to develop was beginning to crack. And yet, despite the storm of strikes, Kojiro did not falter. He did not lash out. Instead, he adapted. With each new strike, he moved with more fluidity, learning from Musashi's unpredictability. His strikes became less about precision and more about flow, about following the rhythm of the fight. Kojiro's movements began to mirror Musashi's, as if he had unlocked a new layer of understanding. It was not about defeating Musashi, it was about becoming one with the rhythm of the battle, allowing the sword to become an extension of his own spirit. Finally, after what felt like hours, both men paused, stepping back to catch their breath. Their swords were raised, their bodies exhausted, but neither was willing to break. Musashi, still calm, regarded Kojiro with a new respect. "You are not what I expected," he said quietly, lowering his swords. "You are not just a product of tradition. You have found something deeper." Kojiro stood still, his breath steady, his sword at his side. "I have learned much from you today, Musashi," he said, his voice calm. "You have shown me a different path, the path of adaptability. But I do not believe I have mastered it yet." Musashi nodded, a slight smile appearing on his face. "Nor have I mastered my own path. The sword is a journey, not a destination. End of 40. The rivalry between them had just begun, not as a battle of supremacy, but as a path of mutual understanding. It was not about defeating the other, it was about learning from one another, pushing each other to new heights. And this, Kojiro realized, was just the beginning of a much deeper journey. The sun was just beginning to dip beneath the horizon, casting a warm glow over the village where Kojiro had made his temporary home. After his duel with Musashi, a silence had settled in his heart, one that had nothing to do with the quiet of the world around him, but with the stillness within. The battle had left him with a sense of unease, not about his technique, nor his ability, but about the nature of the sword itself. His understanding had deepened, but it was not the clarity he had expected. Instead, a question lingered at the back of his mind, a question that refused to be silenced. What was the sword, really? The old man's words came to him again, as they had many times before. The sword is not just an object, it is a reflection of your spirit. Kojiro had always known that the sword was more than just a weapon. But after facing Musashi, after witnessing the raw, unrestrained power of his opponent's two-sword style, Kojiro felt that something had shifted in him. Musashi's style was wild, untamed, and yet it was also precise in its own way. The adaptability, the fluidity, it was something Kojiro had never truly considered. Musashi didn't just wield the sword, he became one with it. In that sense, their duel had not been about one person defeating the other, it had been about understanding how deeply the sword could shape the person who wielded it. Kojiro had learned much from Musashi, but it was not just his technique that had challenged him, it was his spirit. Musashi's approach was rooted in Zen philosophy, adaptability, emptiness, non-attachment principles that could transform the sword from a tool of battle into a tool for enlightenment. And so, Kojiro found himself alone in the quiet of the evening, beneath the oak tree where his training had begun so long ago. His wooden sword was beside him, its presence familiar, yet somehow different. Kojiro sat cross-legged, his back straight, his hands resting gently on his knees. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs. The silence around him was not oppressive. Rather, it was an invitation, a space to reflect, to listen. He had meditated many times before, but tonight, it felt different. Tonight, it felt as though his mind had been cracked open, as if something new were waiting to enter. He focused on his breathing. In, out, in, out. With each breath, he felt his body relax, his muscles loosening. His mind, however, seemed to race, the thoughts returning to the duel. Musashi's unrelenting strikes, the way he flowed between offense and defense, the grace and power of his movements. Adaptability, non-attachment. He thought of these words, allowing them to settle within him. The sword, as Musashi had shown, was a reflection of one's inner state. But what about Kojiro? What had his sword reflected up until now? He had always sought perfection, but in doing so, had he attached himself too closely to tradition? Had he allowed the weight of his training, the expectations of his teachers, to shape him in ways that confined his true nature? Musashi's wildness had shown him a freedom he hadn't known. Existed a freedom that came with letting go of rigid boundaries and embracing the unknown. The sword is a tool of both destruction and enlightenment. This thought rippled through his mind, as clear as the moonlight now spilling through the branches above him. Destruction, yes. The sword was certainly a weapon, and it could cause death whether in battle or in defense of one's life. But what about enlightenment? Could the sword also be a path to understanding? Could it be a way to transcend the violence it had so often been associated with? Kojiro felt a tension within himself, a struggle between two opposing forces. On one side, there was his duty as a samurai, a warrior who wielded the sword as a symbol of power and strength. On the other, there was the Zen philosophy that Musashi had shown him, the path of understanding, of emptiness, of finding peace, not through victory, but through surrender. The sword could destroy, yes, but it could also create. It could lead one to clarity, to focus, to a deep understanding of the self. What is the true nature of the sword? Kojiro's thoughts turned to his past, his childhood, his training under the old man, his struggles to master the blade. In all those years, he had never questioned the sword. It had always been a tool of discipline, of duty, of honor. But now, after his meeting with Musashi, Kojiro realized that there was something more to the blade. It was not just a weapon of war. It was a path that led not only through battle, but through the depths of the soul. He thought of the old man again, and the teachings that had shaped him. The sword is not an object, the old man had said. It is the reflection of your spirit. Kojiro had always taken those words to mean that the sword revealed one's skill, one's ability to control the weapon. But now, as he sat in the stillness of the evening, he understood that it was more than that. The sword was not just a reflection of one's skill, it was a reflection of the inner self, of the soul's deepest desires and fears. Zen, he whispered to himself, remembering the teachings he had heard in passing. The sword is the way of Zen, the path of emptiness, of detachment. Zen was about letting go, about allowing the mind to be free of distractions, to be clear and focused in the present moment. Musashi's approach to the sword, his adaptability, was a direct reflection of this. He had not been bound by tradition. He had not sought to fight for glory or for honor. He had fought to understand, to transcend the ego, the need for recognition, and to see the sword for what it truly was, a path to understanding. Kojiro opened his eyes, his gaze steady as he looked down at his wooden sword. It was not just a tool anymore. It was something deeper, a bridge between the physical and the spiritual, a means to transcend the self. He could feel the weight of the sword in his hands, but now it felt different, lighter, perhaps. He understood now that true mastery came not from control, but from surrendering to the moment, from allowing the sword to guide him, rather than the other way around. He had always believed that the sword was something to be controlled, but now, he realized, it was the sword that controlled him. And that was the true meaning of mastery. The breeze stirred the branches above him, and Kojiro stood slowly, his wooden sword in hand. He raised it, not in preparation for a duel, but in reverence. The sword was not just a tool for destruction. It was a tool for enlightenment, a means of discovering the truth of the self. And as he stood there, bathed in the cool evening light, he felt something stir within him, something deep, something profound. The journey was far from over. The rivalry with Musashi was only the beginning. But Kojiro knew, as he stood in the stillness of the moment, that the path ahead was one not just of battle, but of understanding. Kojiro stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the sword rest gently in his hands. The wooden blade, once a mere extension of his body, now felt like an extension of his spirit. The evening breeze whispered through the branches of the oak tree, carrying with it the scent of earth and freedom. The sword had always been an extension of his physical skill, but now, as he looked at it, he saw it as something more, a tool for awakening, for transcending the limitations of the body and mind. The teachings of Zen, which Musashi had embodied through his movements, resonated deeply within him now. Non-attachment, adaptability. The sword was not a tool for domination or a symbol of pride. It was a means to let go, to flow with life, and to find peace in the present moment. The very essence of the sword, Kojiro now realized, was rooted in the same principles he had seen in Musashi's style: a surrender to the present, an acceptance of whatever came without resistance. He raised the sword slowly in front of him, the tip pointing toward the heavens, the blade resting just above his head. With each breath, he felt the sword become part of him, felt his spirit aligning with the flow of the world around him. It was not a force he controlled, it was a force that flowed through him, guided by the sword, but not bound by it. Kojiro closed his eyes again, the stillness of the world surrounding him, and he allowed himself to relax into the moment. On the other, there was the Zen philosophy that Musashi had shown him, the path of understanding, of emptiness, of finding peace, not through victory, but through surrender. The sword could destroy, yes, but it could also create. It could lead one to clarity, to focus, to a deep understanding of the self. What is the true nature of the sword? Kojiro's thoughts turned to his past, his childhood, his training under the old man, his struggles to master the blade. It was about transcendence. The true mastery of the sword lay in surrendering to it, in allowing the sword to teach him rather than the other way around. The next day, as Kojiro left the village and continued on his journey, his mind remained still. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt truly connected to it. The sword, no longer a mere weapon, was now a companion on his journey of self-discovery. It was no longer about the duel with Musashi, nor the need to prove himself to the world. It was about understanding the deeper nature of the sword, of life, and of himself. In the distance, he could see the outline of a mountain range, a place that had long been a symbol of challenge and struggle. The journey ahead was not one of external battles, but of inner ones, battles to understand, to grow, to evolve. Kojiro had learned that the sword was not just an instrument of war, it was an instrument of enlightenment. As he walked, his thoughts returned to Musashi. The man's unorthodox style, his wildness, had once seemed like the antithesis of everything Kojiro had known. But now, he understood that Musashi's path was a reflection of his own, the path of the sword, as a means to understand oneself, to reach a place of stillness and clarity. Musashi's two-sword style was not just about physical technique. It was about embracing the unknown, surrendering to the flow of the fight, and using the sword as a tool for self-transcendence. Kojiro's path would eventually lead him to face Musashi again. But this time, it would not be about proving his superiority or testing his strength. It would be a meeting of minds, of philosophies, of spirits. The sword would no longer be a symbol of competition. It would be a bridge between them, a shared language of understanding. But for now, Kojiro focused on his journey. His sword remained by his side, a companion in his quest for deeper knowledge, not just of the sword, but of the world itself. As he walked, the weight of the blade seemed lighter, not because of the absence of physical weight, but because of the understanding that had taken root in his heart. Weeks passed, and Kojiro found himself on the banks of another river, the cool water reflecting the sky above. He sat once again, cross-legged on the ground, his sword resting beside him. This time, his thoughts were clearer than ever. He had come to realize that the sword, for all its power and potential for destruction, was also a path to peace, a tool that, when wielded with understanding, could lead one to enlightenment. In that moment of stillness, he thought of the old man, the teacher who had set him on this path. "The sword is the reflection of your spirit," the old man had said. And now, Kojiro understood what that truly meant. The sword was a mirror, yes, but it was not just a reflection of his skill. It was a reflection of his journey, of his growth, and of his ability to find peace in the face of chaos. He stood, lifting his wooden sword, and with one final breath, he whispered to the wind, "I will walk this path, not as a conqueror, but as a student." The path ahead was uncertain, but Kojiro was no longer afraid. The sword was not a means of destruction, it was a means of understanding. And as he walked forward, he carried not just the weight of his blade, but the weight of his newfound clarity. The seasons passed, and with each day, Kojiro's understanding of the sword deepened. The duel with Musashi had left him with more questions than answers, but it had also set him on a path of self-discovery. His mind and spirit, once solely focused on mastery of technique, now sought something more: flow, adaptability, and understanding. Yet, there was one thing that still stirred his heart, the desire to perfect his technique. Tsubame Gaishi, the swallow's return, had been a technique he had seen in the battle with Musashi, a move that had left him in awe. It was a technique of perfect timing, a strike that appeared to come from nowhere, like the wings of a swallow in flight. Musashi had used it with a fluidity and grace that had been almost impossible to anticipate. And now, it was Kojiro's turn to refine it, to make it his own. In a secluded mountain dojo, Kojiro trained alone. The dojo was built high in the mountains, far from civilization, where only the sound of the wind and the soft rustling of the trees filled the air. This was the place where he would perfect his signature technique, the place where he would face not only the sword, but his own mind, sharpening both in isolation. The dojo was simple, a wooden floor that creaked with each step, the walls lined with bamboo. It was a space of solitude and discipline, where every movement mattered, where each swing of the sword could lead to deeper understanding. Kojiro had spent years here, refining his technique, pushing the limits of his strength and precision. But today, there was something different in the air. As Kojiro stood facing the wooden post at the center of the dojo, he felt an unfamiliar stillness, a quiet that had settled deep within him. His breath was steady, his mind calm, as he took up his long katana, the sword that had become an extension of his body and spirit. He had learned many things in the years since his battle with Musashi, and now it was time to test what he had learned. The swallow's return was a move of swiftness and precision, a technique that required a perfect understanding of timing, speed, and control. Kojiro had watched Musashi execute it effortlessly, but he knew it was not just about replicating what he had seen. It was about making the technique his own. He stood still for a moment, focusing on the motion, the flow of the sword through the air. Swallows return a strike so fast that it appeared to come from behind, as though the blade had returned to its starting point before the enemy even knew it had moved. Kojiro raised his sword high, his focus unshaken, and with a fluid motion, he swung the blade downward in the first step of the technique. The sword cut through the air with a sharp hiss, but as it reached its apex, he quickly reversed its path, the blade shifting and turning in the blink of an eye, sweeping up again as though it had returned to its original position. It was beautiful, a blur of motion, a perfect arc of the blade, but Kojiro could feel the imperfection. The timing was off. In that moment of stillness, he thought of the old man, the teacher who had set him on this path. "The sword is the reflection of your spirit," the old man had said. And now, Kojiro understood what that truly meant. The sword was a mirror, yes, but it was not just a reflection of his skill. It was a reflection of his journey, of his growth, and of his ability to find peace in the face of chaos. The flow, the fluidity, was not where it needed to be. His strike was too rigid, too calculated. It lacked the emptiness, the adaptability that Musashi had brought to the move. Kojiro exhaled, his mind clear. He stepped back and repeated the motion, this time with less force and more intent. He allowed the blade to move as though it were an extension of the wind, guided by instinct rather than calculation. His body flowed with the motion, his muscles relaxing into the rhythm of the technique. The technique slowly began to take form, but it wasn't until the end of the day, when the sun had dipped low on the horizon and the dojo was bathed in a golden light, that Kojiro felt the true shift. He raised the blade again, the tip of it pointing toward the sky. And as he swung it down with all his concentration and intention, something clicked. The sword moved, as if it had always known the motion. The swallow's return. It was no longer just a technique. It was a part of him. As the sword sliced through the air in perfect harmony, he felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had not only perfected the technique, he had embodied it. The sword, the movement, the flow of energy, it all came together in that moment. Later that night, as Kojiro sat cross-legged before a small fire, he reflected on the day's training. The technique, now perfected, felt like more than just a physical achievement, it felt like a spiritual one. In that moment of fluid motion, of the sword returning to its starting point, Kojiro had learned something profound. The swallow's return was not just a technique of speed or power, it was a reflection of the self, an expression of balance and adaptability. In every swing of the sword, he realized, there must be a return. A return to center, to stillness, to the present moment. Musashi had taught him the importance of adaptability, of flowing with the battle rather than against it. And now, Kojiro understood that the sword, his sword, was the perfect symbol of that adaptability. The next morning, Kojiro stood once again at the edge of the dojo, the mountains stretching out before him. The technique he had perfected would be his signature move, a tool not just of battle, but of spiritual mastery. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the sword in his hands. It had become something more than just a weapon. It had become a bridge, a path to understanding. And with that understanding came a new clarity about his journey. Kojiro smiled slightly to himself, knowing that the path ahead, though uncertain, would be shaped not by force or aggression, but by adaptability, precision, and a deeper sense of purpose. As the days passed in the quiet mountain dojo, Kojiro's practice continued, with a renewed sense of purpose. The technique of Tsubame Gaishi, Swallow's Return, had become a part of him. Yet the journey was far from complete. He felt a deep responsibility now both to the technique and to himself. The sword was not just a tool of battle, it was a path to understanding, a way to express not only his physical skill but his evolving spirit. But as much as he had refined his technique, Kojiro knew that perfection was a fleeting concept. With each new level of mastery, a deeper understanding of the sword emerged, yet so did new challenges. There was still something missing, something he could not yet grasp completely. It was not the technique itself, but the way it intertwined with his soul. It was as if the sword, though a reflection of his spirit, had not yet unlocked its full potential. One early morning, as the first light of dawn spilled across the dojo, a familiar figure appeared at the doorway. Kojiro turned to see an old friend, Takahashi, a fellow samurai he had trained with in his younger years. Takahashi had heard rumors of Kojiro's progress and had made his way to the mountains to see it for himself. With a warm smile, Takahashi entered the dojo, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "Kojiro," Takahashi greeted, bowing slightly in respect. "I have heard of your travels and of the sword you now wield. You are a legend in the making, it seems." Kojiro smiled and returned the bow. "I've had time and solitude to refine my technique, Takahashi, but there is still much to learn." Takahashi, ever the thoughtful one, stepped forward and placed his hand on the wooden post that stood at the center of the dojo. "I've heard of Tsubame Geishi, the Swallow's Return," he said, his tone filled with both curiosity and admiration. "It is said to be a technique of great beauty and power. Can you show me?" Kojiro's gaze shifted toward the sword resting by his side. He had spent countless hours perfecting the move in isolation, but this was different. Now he was asked to share it. And in sharing, there was the opportunity for further growth, further understanding. With a deep breath, Kojiro nodded. "Very well," he said quietly. "But you must understand that this technique is not just about the sword. It is about the spirit behind it." Takahashi nodded in acknowledgement, eager to learn but understanding the depth of what Kojiro was saying. Kojiro took his position, his feet firm on the ground, his body relaxed but poised. He focused on his breathing, clearing his mind of all distractions. Takahashi watched closely, his eyes fixed on Kojiro's every movement. Kojiro raised the long katana high above his head, the blade catching the light of the early morning Sunday. As his muscles relaxed and his body moved with the rhythm of the technique, he swung the sword down in a perfect arc. But this time, it was not just about the movement, it was about the flow of energy that Kojiro had come to understand. He allowed the sword to shift, to flow, as if it were alive, tracing the perfect return, the swallow's flight. The blade swept through the air with a whisper of motion, then reversed in a smooth, seamless arc. The strike was fluid, there was no pause, no hesitation. Kojiro felt the technique complete itself, like a story told from beginning to end, without interruption. Takahashi stood in stunned silence. He had seen many skilled swordsmen in his time, but what he had witnessed here was something else entirely. The Tsubame Gaishi was not just a move, it was a way of being. It was an expression of perfect harmony, a reflection of the self at peace. "That is incredible," Takahashi said finally, his voice filled with admiration. "Your mastery is not just of the sword, Kojiro. It is of yourself." Kojiro lowered his sword, nodding slowly. "The sword reflects what is within. It is a mirror. And the more we understand it, the more we understand ourselves." Takahashi smiled, his respect for Kojiro deepening. "You are right. The path of the sword is not just about defeating opponents. It is about self-mastery, self-understanding. And I can see now that you have surpassed the limits of technique. You are no longer just a swordsman. You are a master of the spirit." Kojiro remained silent for a moment, his gaze turning inward. The path ahead was not one of triumphs, nor of trophies. It was a path of constant learning, of constant letting go. The technique was his, yes, but it was more than just the skill. It was about flow, adaptability, and understanding principles that went far beyond the sword. "I have much to learn still," Kojiro said softly, his voice reflecting the humility he had come to embrace. "But each step takes me closer to understanding." As the morning sun rose higher in the sky, Kojiro and Takahashi practiced together, their swords moving in harmony. The technique was perfected, yes, but it was not the end. It was the beginning of a new understanding. Kojiro's journey had always been about mastering the sword, but now he understood. The sword was just a tool, a means of self-realization. The true path was not to perfect a technique but to perfect the spirit. The swallow's return was no longer just a beautiful movement, it was a symbol of that journey. A movement of returning, a movement of coming back to center. Just as the swallow returns to the sky, the sword would return to its rightful place within the self, within the soul. The sun was high in the sky, its rays casting long shadows over the land, as word of the upcoming duel spread like wildfire. The rivalry between Sasaki Kojiro and Miyamoto Musashi had been building for years, an inevitable clash between two philosophies, two ways of life, two paths to the sword. The time had come. The duel would take place on a secluded field at the edge of the mountains, a place where the wind howled through the grass and the earth seemed to hold its breath. Everywhere Kojiro went, whispers followed. His name, once known only in a few dojos and villages, was now spoken by the masses. His reputation as a swordsman was solidified, but there was something else now, a quiet, growing tension in the air. Musashi. The name lingered in the minds of everyone who spoke of Kojiro. The wild, unpredictable swordsman with his unorthodox two-sword style. The man who had never been defeated, whose techniques seemed to defy tradition. The man who would meet Kojiro in battle. Kojiro had spent years refining his skill, perfecting his technique, following the traditional teachings passed down through generations of samurai. His precision was unmatched, his grace undeniable. Yet as the duel neared, there was an unsettling feeling in his chest. This was not just another battle, it was a meeting of worlds. Musashi's approach was the antithesis of everything Kojiro had been taught. It was a path that was as wild as it was brilliant. The question that now lingered in Kojiro's mind was simple. Would his traditional approach hold up against the unpredictability of Musashi? Kojiro stood alone in the small dojo, where he had spent years honing his technique. The wooden floor was polished, reflecting the dim light of the evening lanterns. His katana rested by his side, the familiar weight, a constant companion. His training had been unrelenting every day, every moment spent perfecting the swallow's return. His movements graceful and precise, his mind as sharp as his blade. But tonight, the air felt different. As he stood in front of a mirror, his eyes locked on his own reflection, Kojiro could not help but wonder, what was the true nature of his swordsmanship? The sword had been his path for so long, his way of life, his way of understanding the world. But facing Musashi was something new. The duel would not be about tradition or technique. It would be about adaptability, about flow, about who could move beyond the rigid constraints of their own understanding. Kojiro lifted his sword, feeling the weight of it in his hands. His grip was steady, his form flawless. The swallow's return was ready, and so was he. But deep down, he felt the stirring of something else, uncertainty. Musashi's way was unpredictable. His mastery of two swords, two blades, was something that Kojiro had never even considered. It was a challenge to everything he had ever known. And yet, this was the path he must follow. Kojiro closed his eyes and took a slow, deliberate breath. He could not control the outcome of the duel. What he could control was himself. The sword was not just a tool of destruction, it was a means to understand. His spirit would guide him, just as it always had. In contrast, Musashi's preparation was a study in contrast. While Kojiro's method was rooted in discipline and tradition, Musashi's method was far more unorthodox. He had no set routines, no formal training. His approach was instinctual, driven by the moment. Musashi did not believe in being bound by the teachings of the past. He created his own path. Musashi sat in solitude, far from the prying eyes of the world. The place he had chosen for his preparation was not a dojo, but a small hut near the edge of a forest, the wind whispering through the trees. The room was sparse, with only the barest necessities, food, water, and a place to sleep. Yet in the stillness, Musashi found a perfect clarity. His mind was focused. His thoughts were clear. He looked at his two swords, the twin blades that were the heart of his style. He had trained with them for years, and yet he knew that every duel was an opportunity for something new. His approach was not to plan, but to respond. Musashi had no formal expectations. He did not think of the duel in terms of victory or defeat. To him, it was simply a means of understanding. Musashi lifted his swords in front of him, the wooden blades heavy in his hands. He imagined the duel with Kojiro in his mind, not in terms of battle strategy, but in terms of flow. He could picture the movements, the strikes, the counters, the rhythm of the fight. Musashi was not concerned with who would win. The duel was a test of their spirits. The sword, he believed, was not just an object, it was a path to emptiness, to transcend attachment, to be one with the moment. In his mind, Musashi began to move, his body flowing with the rhythm of the imagined duel. The movements were fluid, as if the swords had become extensions of his spirit. Each strike was perfect. Each counter was anticipated before it even began. His mind was not focused on Kojiro's strength or precision. He did not concern himself with his opponent's reputation. The duel, in Musashi's mind, was simply a moment to be experienced, a chance to test the limits of his understanding. As the day of the duel approached, both men found themselves on the precipice of something greater than they could have ever anticipated. The tension in the air was palpable. This was not a duel between two warriors. It was a meeting of two philosophies. Kojiro, the embodiment of traditional discipline, versus Musashi, the living representation of adaptability and self-discovery. For Kojiro, the duel was a test of his path, a path shaped by years of tradition and unwavering discipline. He had always believed in the sword as a reflection of one's spirit, but now, faced with Musashi's unpredictability, he found himself questioning what that truly meant. Could his traditional training withstand the fluidity of Musashi's style? For Musashi, the duel was not about proving his superiority. It was not about tradition or technique. It was about understanding. He believed that the sword was a way to transcend the self, to let go of the ego, to be free of the past. The duel with Kojiro would not be a fight for victory. It would be a moment to test the limits of his own understanding. The day finally arrived, the day when the two swordsmen would meet on the battlefield. The wind howled across the rocky plains of Funajima, the island chosen for the duel, carrying with it the weight of destiny. Kojiro and Musashi stood facing each other, each in silence, their swords resting lightly in their hands. The field was empty save for the two of them, the tension between them thick in the air. Kojiro looked across at Musashi, his heart steady, his mind focused. He had prepared for this moment, but something inside him told him that this would not be like any duel he had fought before. There would be no rigid rules here. There would be no tradition, no honor. There would only be the sword, and the understanding that would emerge from it. Musashi stood just as still, his eyes calm, his body relaxed. He had no need for words. His mind was already in the moment, already in the flow of the duel. There was nothing to prove. There was only the sword, and the understanding it would reveal. The time had come, the day had come, and Funajima Island was bathed in a thick, heavy mist that rolled in from the sea. The tension in the air was palpable, as the time for the fateful duel between Sasaki Kojiro and Miyamoto Musashi approached. Warriors from distant villages, curious travelers, and scholars who had heard the legends gathered at the edges of the island, their gazes fixed on the rocky plain where the two swordsmen would meet. The stakes were not just for honor or victory, they were for something far greater: the clash of philosophies, the battle between tradition and adaptability, discipline and freedom. As the sky darkened, Kojiro stood alone at the center of the field, his posture unwavering, his grip tight on the long katana in his hand. The sword had become an extension of his body, a reflection of his spirit. Years of training, endless hours spent refining the technique of Tsubame Gaishi, Swallow's Return, had led him to this moment. His focus was absolute. The sharpness of his blade mirrored the sharpness of his mind. Every breath, every movement was steady and controlled. He was ready. But as the minutes ticked by, Kojiro began to feel the weight of the anticipation. The duel had been set for dawn, yet there was no sign of Musashi. The gathering crowd shifted uneasily, some murmuring that perhaps Musashi had failed to arrive. Others, however, were silent, watching the figure of Kojiro, who stood in stoic silence, his eyes scanning the horizon. Where was Musashi? As Kojiro stood in stillness, a figure appeared on the distant path leading toward the battlefield. The figure was unmistakable, Miyamoto Musashi. He walked slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on the ground as he approached the duel. Kojiro's eyes narrowed. The duel was to be a test of both skill and spirit, and Musashi was late, deliberately so, no doubt. It was a subtle challenge, a test of patience, of composure. Musashi had arrived on his own time, showing no regard for the tradition or rules that govern duels. His very presence felt like a challenge to Kojiro's beliefs. But Musashi's arrival was not the only surprise. As the distance between them closed, Kojiro noticed that Musashi did not carry his usual katana. Instead, Musashi held in his hands a wooden sword, baken, a practice weapon, light and unsharpened. The crowd gasped. The challenge was clear. Musashi was not here to fight by the traditional rules. His use of a wooden sword instead of a real blade was a statement, a move designed to provoke and unnerve Kojiro. Was Musashi mocking him? Or was it a deeper test of skill, a challenge to prove that a true swordsman could win regardless of the weapon? Kojiro's grip tightened on his katana. This was no ordinary duel. Musashi stopped at the edge of the battlefield, his eyes still locked on Kojiro. He bowed low, a simple gesture of respect, but one that held no pretense. Kojiro returned the bow, his expression neutral, though his heart raced. "You are late," Kojiro said, his voice calm, betraying no emotion. "And you come armed with a mere wooden sword." Musashi raised his eyes, his expression unreadable. "The sword is but a tool," he replied softly. "It is not the weapon, but the wielder that matters." The tension between them thickened. Kojiro, steeped in tradition and discipline, knew that this duel was more than a battle for physical supremacy. It was a test of their very philosophies. Could his precision and mastery of the long katana defeat Musashi's unpredictable, unorthodox style? Or would Musashi's adaptability and mastery of the baken, with his deep understanding of the sword as a spiritual tool, prove victorious? Without another word, the duel began. Kojiro moved first. His long katana cut through the air with deadly precision, aiming for Musashi's side. The strike was swift, clean, and measured, each motion honed through years of practice. But Musashi, despite his simple wooden sword, moved with an ease and grace that seemed almost supernatural. He stepped aside with fluidity, his body swaying like a reed in the wind. His baken intercepted Kojiro's blade with barely any resistance, redirecting it with a subtle but powerful motion. The first strike was neutralized. Musashi countered immediately, his baken swinging toward Kojiro's head with such speed that it was almost impossible to follow. But Kojiro was prepared. His katana raised in a high guard, blocking the blow just in time. He could feel the force of the wooden sword, but it was no match for the steel of his blade. They circled each other, the clash of their swords ringing out with each move. Kojiro's technique was flawless, his strikes precise, but Musashi's movements were unpredictable, like the wind itself. He adapted, flowing between offense and defense with seamless ease, as if he were dancing with the air around him. Musashi's unpredictability was beginning to unsettle Kojiro. Kojiro pressed harder, aiming a series of strikes with increasing intensity. His long katana cut through the air with deadly purpose, each blow intended to overwhelm Musashi's defenses. But Musashi met each strike with uncanny accuracy, his baken moving in ways that seemed to defy logic. He flowed around Kojiro's blade, redirecting each strike with minimal effort. There was no brute strength in his movements, only adaptability, flow, and non-resistance. Kojiro's mind began to race. His strikes, though powerful and precise, were being absorbed by Musashi's calmness. There was no hesitation in Musashi's movements, no fear. The way he wielded the wooden sword, so effortlessly, seemed almost as if the weapon had become a part of him, like an extension of his own being. The battle was a blur of motion. The crowd watched in awe as the two swordsmen moved as if they were one with the wind. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, Kojiro began to feel his fatigue creeping in. The technique, the precision, it all began to take a toll on him. His breathing grew heavier. His body grew tired. Musashi, however, seemed unaffected. His pace never faltered. His strikes never slowed. The bokken was no longer just a weapon, it was part of his philosophy, his very being. He wasn't trying to overpower Kojiro, he was simply flowing with him, letting Kojiro's movements guide his own. And then, it happened. Kojiro, his muscles straining with exhaustion, took a final swing, a powerful, sweeping arc intended to end the duel. He put everything into that strike, every ounce of his strength, his precision, his years of training. His katana came down with the speed of a thunderclap, a blow that should have been decisive, but Musashi, with a fluid, almost imperceptible movement, stepped aside, his bokken snapping up in a perfect arc, striking Kojiro's exposed side with a gentle, controlled motion. The impact was like a bolt of lightning. Kojiro staggered, his body thrown off balance by the precision of the strike. He fell to his knees, the tip of his katana skimming the ground beside him. The duel was over. Kojiro sat on the ground, breathing heavily, his hand gripping his katana. Musashi stood before him, his bokken lowered, his expression unreadable. There was no triumph in his eyes, no sense of victory, only the calm, serene presence that had defined his every move. Kojiro looked up at him, his chest rising and falling. He was defeated not just in technique, but in spirit. Musashi had not only outwitted him physically, but he had outpaced his own understanding of the sword. "I see now," Kojiro said softly, his voice strained. "It was never about the weapon." Musashi nodded. "It was never about the weapon. It was about the spirit. The sword is a reflection of who you are." Kojiro remained silent, processing the weight of Musashi's words. The sword was not just a tool for destruction. It was a path, a journey of the self, a means of letting go, of adaptability and understanding. The mist had not fully cleared when the duel ended. The quiet of the battlefield was deafening, the sound of wind and waves against the rocks the only sound that remained. The crowd, once tense with anticipation, now stood in stunned silence as Sasaki Kojiro lay on the ground, his katana at his side. The battle had been fierce, but in the end, Musashi's fluidity, his understanding of the sword, had triumphed. Kojiro's breathing slowed, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Musashi stood over him, his wooden sword lowered to the ground. There was no expression of triumph in his eyes, no boastful smile. He had not defeated Kojiro out of malice, nor to prove his superiority. He had simply followed the flow of the fight, allowing the sword to guide him. As the world around them fell silent, Musashi knelt beside Kojiro, his gaze softening. The two men had shared a rivalry that had transcended mere competition. Kojiro's discipline, his dedication to his craft, had pushed Musashi to new heights. But it had also revealed something deeper, the true meaning of the sword. Kojiro's breathing became shallow, his body still. Musashi did not speak at first. Instead, he looked down at the man who had been both his rival and, in many ways, his mirror. Kojiro had embodied the path of tradition, the discipline and precision of the long sword. He had been a master of technique, his understanding of the sword profound. And yet, Musashi had defeated him not with superior skill, but with a deeper understanding of the sword's true nature. As Kojiro's life faded, Musashi whispered quietly, almost to himself, "The sword is not the blade. It is the mind that wields it." As in the days that followed the duel, news of Kojiro's death spread across the land. His place in history was sealed, not just as a master swordsman, but as a symbol of discipline, tradition, and precision. His name would be spoken for generations to come, a legend not just for his skill with the long sword, but for his unwavering dedication to his path. Kojiro had been the embodiment of the samurai code, a warrior who had devoted his life to mastering his craft. His death, while tragic, marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. In his final moments, he had realized that the sword was more than just a tool of war, it was a reflection of the spirit, a means to transcend the self. His Tsubame Gaeshi, perfected through years of practice, would live on as a testament to his artistry, his discipline, and his understanding of the sword as a path to enlightenment. But Musashi's journey was far from over. He stood alone in the field after the duel, the sun beginning to set behind him, casting long shadows over the ground. The crowds had dispersed, leaving him in the quiet of his own thoughts. His victory, though significant, felt empty in a way he had not expected. Musashi sat down, his back resting against a large stone, the weight of the bokken heavy in his hands. The duel had been a reflection of more than just physical skill. It had been a test of their spirits, their philosophies, their understanding of the sword. And in Kojiro's defeat, Musashi had learned something new. For all his skill, Kojiro had been bound by tradition, by the strictures of his training. He had approached the sword as a tool to be mastered, a means of proving his strength. But Musashi had always believed the sword was something more. It was a path not just to victory, but to understanding. Kenjutsu, the way of the sword, was not about defeating others. It was about mastering oneself. Musashi reflected on the duel, on how Kojiro had fought with precision, with grace. His movements had been beautiful, flawless in their execution, but they had been too rigid, too fixed in the form. The sword is not about form, Musashi realized. It is about flow. It is about adapting to the moment, about understanding that the world is in constant motion. Musashi's philosophy had always been rooted in Zen principles: emptiness, adaptability, and non-attachment. The duel had reinforced this. It was not enough to simply be skilled with the sword. One had to be free from attachment, free from the ego, free from the need to impose one's will on the world. The sword was not a weapon of destruction. It was a tool for understanding, for transcending the self. In Kojiro, Musashi had seen the mirror of his own journey. The discipline, the precision, the dedication, these were not wrong. They were simply one path, a path that led to mastery of the sword. But Kojiro had not gone beyond the sword. He had not transcended it. Musashi, on the other hand, had walked the path of freedom, a path that allowed him to adapt, to flow with the moment, and to see the sword as not a weapon, but a means of self-mastery. Musashi stood up, his bokken resting in his hand. He closed his eyes and let the wind wash over him. The duel with Kojiro had been a test not of who was the better swordsman, but of who could transcend the ego, who could master the self. And in the stillness of the moment, Musashi understood something profound. The sword was a journey, not an endpoint. The true mastery of the sword lay not in defeating others, but in mastering oneself, in surrendering to the moment, in letting go of everything that held one back. As the days turned into weeks, Musashi's thoughts turned to the Book of Five Rings, the text he would eventually write, detailing his philosophy of swordsmanship. He had always believed the sword was a means to understanding, but now, in the quiet of the aftermath of the duel, he felt an even deeper sense of clarity. The sword, the swordsmanship, the victory, it all paled in comparison to the path of enlightenment it could offer. Kojiro's legacy would live on, as a master of technique and discipline, his name etched in history. But Musashi's journey was just beginning. The sword was not just a means to an end, it was a living path, a way to transcend the self, to understand the world, and to reach a place of peace. As the sun set over the battlefield, where the duel had taken place, Musashi looked out over the horizon. He had learned from Kojiro, yes, but the true lesson was one that transcended even the sword itself. It was about freedom, freedom from the ego, freedom from the need to impose one's will on the world. And so, the sword became something more. It became a way of life. Though Sasaki Kojiro lost his life at Funajima, his spirit, his philosophy, and his technique have lived on, transcending time and place. Kojiro was not just a master of the sword, he was a symbol of the samurai spirit, a reflection of discipline, tradition, and self-mastery. His Tsubame Gaeshi, Swallow's Return, perfected through years of unwavering dedication, became more than a technique. It became a part of Japan's cultural heritage, a testament to the artistry and precision that defines the way of the sword. The way of the sword, or kenjutsu, is not just a physical skill, it is a way of life, a constant pursuit of discipline, enlightenment, and the mastery of oneself. Kojiro's journey, though cut short, has inspired warriors, philosophers, and artists alike. His legacy continues to shape the culture of Japan, offering lessons not just in combat, but in the art of life itself. Even after his passing, Kojiro remains an enduring symbol of dedication, of the strength that comes from following the path of self-discovery. His legacy reminds us all that mastery of the sword is not just about the blade, it is about the heart. This is the story of Sasaki Kojiro, a man who, through the way of the sword, became a symbol of the samurai spirit. His journey is a reminder that, in the end, the path of the sword is not only a path of battle, but a path to the heart, a path to self-understanding, to discipline, and to the mastery of one's spirit. It is a path we all walk, in different ways, and in different forms, but one that always leads to the same destination, the realization of who we are and the truth that lies within. As the night falls and the world around you quiets, remember the lessons of Sasaki Kojiro and Miyamoto Musashi, that the true battle is within. May their journey of mastery and self-discovery inspire you as you rest tonight. Take a moment to reflect on your own path, your own growth, and may your dreams be filled with clarity and peace. Good night, and remember, the path to mastery begins with each step, even the ones we take in our sleep. Sleep well, and let your spirit recharge for tomorrow's journey.